There had been big changes in the Prince of Wales's office, including its location. Following the death of the Queen Mother, Clarence House, where she had lived, was refurbished at a cost of nearly £5 million to provide a new home for the Prince of Wales and his family. Since the divorce, they had lived at York House, across the courtyard, and the office had been in St James's Palace next door. They are all part of the same complex, but Clarence House has the advantage of having staterooms and a large, private garden at the back, where the prince can entertain. They moved in 2003, by which time the household was looking very different. Stephen Lamport had left in the summer of 2002 to join the Royal Bank of Scotland. He had been deputy and then private secretary for 9 years. His replacement was Sir Michael Peat, who came from Buckingham Palace. As Keeper of the Privy Purse, he had been the architect of a major modernization program there, and his appointment was seen as a way of repairing the relationship between the two palaces, a relationship that, to quote one member of the household, had been comprehensively bulldozed. Mark Bolland, Deputy Private Secretary, widely thought to have been driving the bulldozer, left to set up his own public relations consultancy. He also began writing a gossipy column in the News of the World under the pseudonym Blackadder, in which he occasionally bit the hand that had once fed him. And Colleen Harris, the Prince's press secretary, left in the autumn of 2003, exhausted by the long hours and constant firefighting and wanting to see something of her teenage sons. The man brought in to mastermind the relationship with the press was 40-year-old Paddy Harverson, a former Financial Times sports journalist, who had spent the previous 3 years at Manchester United, the world's biggest and most successful football club. There he had been dealing with giant egos, millionaires and megastars like David Beckham and Rio Ferdinand, and perpetually managing intense tabloid interest and scandal. He arrived in October 2003 with a brand new broom, and no sense of awe towards his employer and his family. Michael Peat's remit was to get the Prince of Wales's private life out of the newspapers and his good works into them, and Paddy's was to rebuild trust and bridges with Buckingham Palace. He is an imposing figure at 6 feet 4 inches tall, and brought his height's worth of integrity into the mire of cunning spin and favoritism that had blighted the previous regime. He made it clear from the beginning that there was to be no spin, no favors, and that the palace was no longer going to lie down and take whatever the tabloids threw at it. He had scarcely had time to make his first cup of coffee in the office when an action that Clarence House had taken against the Mail on Sunday before he arrived came to fruition. The newspaper had run a story that Prince William had speared and killed a dwarf antelope, called a dick, during a holiday in Kenya. It spawned national outrage, despite a statement from Clarence House that the story was untrue. The Mail on Sunday claimed it had a good source and refused to back down, so the palace issued a formal complaint to the PCC and the newspaper folded its tents. Speaking on BBC Radio 4's Today programme, Paddy said, "Now, hopefully, they will understand that we do take things seriously and will hold them to account where we feel that they are wrong and have evidence to prove that they are wrong." Paddy took her points one by one. He wrote that, "These comments make it entirely clear that Ms. Sarler has little or no understanding of Harry as a person and how he has spent his current gap year. It was a very unfair and unfounded attack, full of ill-informed and insensitive criticism." The next week, her column was an out-and-out attack on Paddy Harverson. 2 months later, when The Sun ran the photograph of William and Kate kissing in the snow at Closters, Paddy punished the newspaper. In an unprecedented move, he banned Arthur Edwards, its veteran royal photographer, from future photo calls with both William and Harry. Arthur had been outside the Lindo wing the day of William's birth. He'd been one of Diana's favorites, a real gentleman of the profession. The industry was as shocked as he was, but it sent out a powerful message. During William's final year, with the first set of his exams looming, Harry was in the news again. During the Christmas vacation, the two of them had been to a fancy dress party in Wiltshire given by his great friend James Mead, son of Richard Mead, the Olympic showjumper. The theme had been colonial and native. William had dressed as a lion and Harry, in a local fancy dress shop, had found a German desert costume with a Nazi armband. With all the awareness of the average 20-year-old, he had thought nothing beyond its colonial connotation. Meanwhile, the adults around him, who perhaps ought to have been more conscious that a Nazi outfit was not such a good idea, did not think to point that out to him. Someone at the party took a photograph. "Harry the Nazi," screamed the Sun headline. As luck would have it, the party was shortly before Holocaust Memorial Day, in which the royal family were taking a leading role. The newspapers milked it for all it was worth, drawing attention also to the cigarette and the drink in his hand. Some of his critics, tall on their soapboxes, suggested that Harry wasn't fit to attend Sandhurst, where he was due to go later in the year. Clarence House immediately put out a statement. "Prince Harry has apologized for any offense or embarrassment he has caused. He realizes it was a poor choice of costume. But there were those, of course, who were not prepared to accept this apology." William took the whole incident, removed as he was from Harry and home, very badly. The university has an amazingly over-the-top system for dealing with students who have got personal or medical issues that impact upon their work, says John Walden, and the student can ask for special circumstances to be taken into account. William had obviously spent a lot of time talking to his brother and not revising for exams, and so he came to me and said, "I'm having a bit of a crisis. What do I do about my exams?" He was really wound up about the way the press was treating his brother. It was obvious that he was very upset, so we had a conversation. In the end, William sat the first lot of his final exams that January with no special dispensation. Final exams are no longer as important as they used to be at St. Andrews. An honors degree is now modular, a calculation of all the marks gained during the final 2 years at the university, so a proportion of the outcome had already been determined by module exams, classwork, coursework, essays, field trips and the dissertation. He had thought long and hard about his dissertation, as do most students, and been to see Charles Warren the summer before about the subjects he was chewing over. He had thought he might do a study on the impact of deer management on wild land in the Highlands. It was never mentioned by name, but Balmoral would have been the obvious location for any such study. He decided, instead, to write about conservation in the tropical seas, or more accurately indigenous fishing practices on the island of Rodriguez and the effect these practices have on coral reefs. It was one of these things where the locals take dynamite and blow the fish out of the water, which obviously doesn't do the coral reef any good, says John Walden. I suspect he must have had some involvement with a conservation group that were working on this island and may have had some previous contact with them, because he went out and did 2 or 3 weeks field work out there with this group, which essentially involved a lot of scuba diving on the corals. He was absolutely right. Rodriguez was the island in the Indian Ocean William had visited during his gap year with Mark Dyer, where they had dived. This time he could indulge his passion for scuba diving in the interests of academe. Looking back on it all, John Walden says, "My real specialism is looking at long-term climate records." He was interested in climate change. Everybody could be interested in that. But if I started to talk to him about the minutiae of how you interpret a pollen record, his eyes would be glazed over. I did nag him and say he should go off and support some major conservation works and become a figurehead for solving the climate change problem. Your mum would have liked that, I said. But he wasn't having any of it. He was going to go off and do his military training.